So in this segment, we're going to be covering Boris Johnson to bypass Cabinet Office and hand over unredacted messages directly to the COVID inquiry. So what's happened is this is essentially a case of Johnson versus Sunak. So what Johnson has done is he's bypassed the Cabinet Office, who are meant to be dealing with this stuff, right? So the Cabinet Office are the ones that have been tasked with giving all the records and all the messages to the inquiry, right? So what Boris Johnson said is, nah, I'll do it myself. Because he doesn't want the Cabinet Office to redact anything because they'll do what's in their interest. And the person leading the inquiry, what she said is that give me everything and I'll decide what is relevant and what isn't. But there's something important to note, as Henry Zeffman points out, which is Boris Johnson has passed lots of WhatsApps to the Cabinet Office, but only date from May 2021 onwards because of the fact that he's got a new phone. He claims his old phone was a security risk, and therefore he's only handed over the stuff from May 2021, which I think this is nonsense. I think he's lying here. I don't think his phone's that much of a risk, but it's clearly damaging stuff that he doesn't want to hand back. Because I think what Johnson is gambling on, as other commentators have pointed out, Boris Johnson is going to probably face a 10-day plus suspension from the standards committee. He's going to get voted out and he's going to come back as the MP for another constituency. And I think whatever's in those messages before May 2021 must be incredibly damaging. Let's not forget Johnson is the one who said let the bodies pile high and all of that kind of stuff. So clearly whatever's before May 2021 is damaging. He doesn't want to hand over, but he's handed over the stuff that might make the other people look bad. And we'll have to wait and see what exactly is he handed over. What can we see from these messages? And the Cabinet Office told Boris Johnson that they're going to pull his taxpayer-funded legal advice for the inquiry if he carries on undermining the government's position. So it's very clear that Boris Johnson is trying to damage Sunak as much as possible, and the Cabinet Office are not happy about it, and they're going to make him pay out of pocket for his legal fund. What I did see is a couple of people tweeting that if this does happen, if the Cabinet Office do this, then they'll set up a GoFundMe essentially for Johnson's legal fund because they want to see what the messages are. Kind of anti-lockdown people. So there are people who are willing to essentially pay out of their own pocket, not just their taxes that have been taken, but out of pocket to help Boris Johnson. So that would be incredibly interesting to see if the Cabinet Office actually do this, because this is public infighting between the Tory party. These are people publicly fighting each other over this, and it's incredible, absolutely incredible to see. There's some more here. When it comes to the inquiry as well, kind of Sky News have said that it's politically helpful that the inquiry vaccine module has suddenly moved up, so it features as we go into the next election, sort of into the next summer, rather than the hospital module, which has been pushed back to next autumn, or the care home, which has been kicked into 2025. So I imagine that Rishi Sunak will want to trigger an election before this hospital module, because that's where you're going to see a lot of the austerity stuff, a lot of the cuts that this government has done, and the impact, the Tories have done to the NHS, and see what the impact is of those cuts. The lack of beds, which I think Tony Blair actually played a part in as well, cutting the amount of beds, the lack of ICU units, the lack of staff and things like that. These are the things we'll see when it comes to the hospital module, the damage the Tories have done in this regard. But the problem is, if that comes out after the election, it doesn't really change much. The care home one's going to be brutal as well, because from what I've read regarding the care homes, this is when Matt Hancock effectively let COVID patients go into the care homes. This is a care home that's not far from where I live, saying the Northamptonshire home was one of the hundreds across England put under unprecedented pressure after Hancock, the then Health Secretary, ordered a wave of discharges into care homes amid fears COVID would overwhelm them. And one of the inspectors saying, quote, the staff were overrun, they were short-staffed, and then the influx of people, they couldn't cope. One end quote. So one family member or one person saying that when they visited their relatives in the in these homes, they gulped down water when they were offered it because they were so thirsty. They weren't given the care that they deserved. And when community nurses were finally deployed, they found people in soiled bedding and made a large number of safeguarding referrals. And this was the state of the care homes, which were incredibly overrun. And I think this is where we will see more evidence of the state of the care homes in this country, which I think are abysmal. I think they are places where old people, some of these care homes anyways, are places where old people are just sent to die, out of sight, out of mind kind of thing. And, the High Court already ruled that the government failed to take into action the risk to elderly and vulnerable residents from non-symptomatic transmission. And there was a point where obviously we didn't know about asymptomatic transmission, but once the government did, they needed to take more action, and they needed to make sure there were much more testing going towards helping out care homes, because this is where the biggest threat was with the pandemic. that it was the older, more vulnerable people who were basically grouped together in these homes, which were always going to be at risk from increased amounts of deaths, and they were. A lot more of them died, and it was tragic the way that these older people have been treated. And this is the stuff where, in that COVID inquiry, when this stuff comes out, I think this stuff will be damaging. But the problem is that's kicked into 2025, so we have to wait on that one for a while. And, this is a bitter fight between, essentially between different ministers. And, Matt Hancock will probably be involved in this as well. He would not want to give over a lot of the messages. And we know from Isabel Oakeshott, in the leaks that she did via I think it was the Telegraph, that there were a lot of gnarly stuff here, a lot of government kind of involvement trying to influence the media, amongst other things. This is not good for the Tories, and we need, as a public, we deserve to find out what exactly happened, what was going on in the decision making here. And we got, this clip of Rishi Sunak, which I've already played before. But when you look at it, when you look at how kind of uncomfortable this guy is, you can see that, this COVID inquiry, I think it's rattled him, to be honest.
Well, I think it's really important that we learn the lessons of COVID, and that's why the inquiry was established. And we want to make sure that whatever lessons there are to be learned are learned, and we do that in a spirit of transparency and candour. The government has cooperated with the inquiry. Tens of thousands of documents have been handed over.
And this is where he keeps talking about, I know I've played this one before, so I'm not going to play it, but he kept saying, we've handed over tens of thousands of documents, and when they're asked, are you going to take the inquiry to judicial review, he kept glitching back to tens of thousands of documents been handed over. And we know now that government are taking their own inquiry, right? This is an inquiry Boris Johnson wanted, and Boris Johnson ordered it because of the fact that he wanted to delay questioning around COVID for a much later date. And so he's like, I can't answer that question, we're going to wait for the inquiry. Now the inquiry is happening, and Rishi Sunak is desperate to avoid it, because let's not forget, this guy was Chancellor during the pandemic. A lot of those dodgy contracts and stuff would have ran through his office. So the simple fact is he's in trouble. When they look at the stuff around the contracts and all that kind of stuff, he's the one, his fingerprints are all over it, because he was Chancellor. He's the one that allowed a lot of these contracts to happen. The Eat Out to Help Out scheme that, increased the spread of COVID, they're going to ask him about that. Did you have any scientific discussions around what the impact of that scheme would be? Because we know it helped spark a bigger second wave. So he's got a lot of questions they're asking about him, and he's not going to have a lot of answers for him. And we go to kind of the last thing I think I wanted to discuss here, which is that, a BBC Question Time member asked about this judicial review, and they were essentially the Tory MP admitted that he'd be surprised if the government won its legal challenge over the WhatsApp messages. This is a massive waste of taxpayers' money, because it's going to be taxpaid lawyers effectively fighting the government's case for them. This is a waste of the court's time as well, but the fact is, the reason why I think they're doing this is to delay the inquiry even further and push it much later on, that these things would come out past the general election. Some of this stuff, because they know how damaging this stuff is. They know it, and that's why they're trying to delay it. Boris Johnson, I think his biggest mistake was ordering this inquiry to happen, because his fingerprints are all over this stuff, and he's trying to protect himself by saying, I've handed over everything, when he hasn't. He's only handed over stuff from May 2021, which won't include the most damaging things. So the Tory party should be very concerned about what's happening with their party, because I genuinely think this is, I think they're sunk, but I think this is the burial. I think this will be the burial for them, because they let so many people die from this pandemic, so many more that didn't have to die. I think we had the highest per capita deaths in kind of out of any of the developed countries. That's mad, and the fact that we have healthcare free at the point of use, which some other countries don't have. We should have done better. But, the fact is, the Tories always knew that a pandemic would be the most damaging thing to hit Britain, and they just didn't do anything about it. And that's the biggest tragedy. The Tories just didn't care in the end. I just don't know what more to say about this, but I hope the government lose in that judicial review. I hope they get embarrassed by the judges, similar to what happened over the proroguing stuff. And, I just despair at this, guys. Honestly, I just despair, and I don't know what happens. This is such a circus. The government's own inquiry being sued by the government because they don't want these WhatsApp messages to be handed over. It's just madness, absolute madness. But anyways, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Support the channel on Patreon if you can. And hopefully I'll see you in the next one.